Welcome to the First Church Leaders Podcast.
Well, good morning and welcome to the Leaders Podcast of First United Methodist Church in Lexington, Kentucky. My name is Carol Cooper and I'm the Associate Pastor of our downtown campus. And this morning it is my honor to welcome Reverend Esther Jodhav. Esther is an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church, and she is the Associate Vice President of Intercultural Affairs at Asbury University. She's also a dear friend to many of our church family, and so I'm really excited to be able to talk with her this morning and have her share about her work in culture and ethnicity and cross-cultural competence. So welcome, Esther. Why don't you begin by telling us a little bit about yourself and what led you to this being your calling in life and what you're working on at the university and how you have helped engage Lexington and First Church and this area with this incredible, rich and needed conversation.
Yeah. Good morning, Carol. Thank you so much for the warm welcome, and to all those that will be listening to this podcast, greetings to you. And what a joy to be able to share something that has genuinely just been a part of my journey. I think as I have been in your community, whether it's at Andover, whether it's at downtown campus, whether it's been at offerings, those are the three places that I have had the opportunity to come and preach. And it has just been a delightful experience to be in the first UMC family for me. And actually, you know, it's not just for me. I think you will remember my brother, Dr. Emmanuel Jodhav. He still has membership at First UMC, even though he's moved to Michigan and works at Ferris University there. He and his wife have really enjoyed their membership with the First UMC family. And so I am delighted, and Carol, it's a delight to get to do this with you. I really appreciate the call that I got from Todd a couple weeks ago when he said, hey, can you do this for us? And I said, of course, yes. You know, pardon?
Hard to tell Todd no.
I know, but you know, when it's a topic that you are so energized by, you can't help but say no. And I think as far as I can remember, and as long as I can remember, talking about my faith and my understandings of culture, or just talking about faith and culture, have really been something that I get so energized by, so motivated by. You know, I could be having the hardest day, or I could be having the most exhausting day. But if anybody wants to talk about, hey, let's talk about what God is up to, and let's talk about how we as God's people across the universe, right? So just talking about people across the universe, across the globe, and how we as those people engage with God and what God is doing has always been of very great interest for me. So Carol, when I was thinking about our purpose this morning is to really look at how do we build cultural competencies? What does that even mean?
Right. Yeah, I think a definition would be great.
Right. And at the basic, I mean, I could give you a textbook definition, but I will leave that for another day. But what I'm about to share is informed by a textbook definition. And if there are any listeners who are interested in this, there's a book by David Livermore titled Cultural Intelligence. And there are many, many other books. There's plethora of them that are just popping up, right? Because it's a popular topic these days. Once again, it's a popular topic because our nation, North America, has dealt with some very explosive situations, you know, such as the killing of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, right here in Louisville. And it has really ignited this conversation with a whole nother level of urgency.
Right.
And so the book is called Cultural Intelligence by David Livermore.
We'll link that in our notes on the podcast. So
that'll be great. Yeah, and actually you could just even go to the Cultural Intelligence website. They have a plethora of articles that come up, and it is free to access. One of the reasons I have enjoyed David Livermore's understanding of cultural intelligence is because he comes out of his own experience of being on mission trips. So David Livermore grew up in a Christian faith context right here in the United States. He's currently in Michigan. And it was all these mission trips that our churches and congregations are known to take. There's a rich heritage across the Christian tradition of doing mission work. And it was out of those experiences when David Livermore traveled overseas that he discovered the need to understand people who are different. So Carol, you're just going to have to pause me when you need to pause me, because I will just keep going.
Please do. You're the one with the knowledge. I just get to be the host. So,
well, yeah. So the definition of cultural intelligence in a simplistic form is just one's capacity to work with people who are culturally, ethnically, religiously different from one's self. So right here in our conversation, Carol, you and I could identify multiple ways in which we are different, and yet we're similar.
Right.
So you are from the United States, I am from India. You grew up in a different context of the United States. I grew up in Mumbai, in a city where there's like gazillions of people. So we could list the differences that you and I share, and perhaps I should have thought about it sooner, so I would have had a longer list of.
Right. Well, just thinking of you growing up in Mumbai, I grew up moving around. And so in one of the areas we lived was in Montana, which is very rural, right? I mean, I grew up in a city in Montana, but even knowing that, it's very different than a large, highly populated area. So, yeah.
Yeah, so right there, Carol, you've helped give a tangible example how who we are and the context in which we grow, while they're different, they actually inform who we become as people, right? So one of these first moments that I had in my life when I came to Kentucky 21 years ago, so September 3rd will be 21 years ago that I've been living in this little town of Wilmore. And I remember just, coming up on 68 from the airport, from Bluegrass into Wilmore. One of the first words, Carol, out of my mouth were, I wonder who lives here besides God. Because if you're driving on 68 coming into Wilmore, to your left and to your right, you see a lot of fields. And for me, you don't see that in Mumbai. If you want to see fields, you've got to go to the villages, right? So we call them the countrysides or, the rural areas. And so these distinctions do impact our frame of thinking. And so cross-cultural competence or intercultural competency is really my capacity, your capacity, our capacity as a collective people to know how to engage with those differences. And you asked me, like, how did I get interested in this topic? I really don't know that I can point to a particular moment. But growing up in India, I think I had the luxury of living in diversity, right? Unlike what I'm discovering in the United States, we have certain locations that like demonstrate a lot of diversity. There's a richness from the urban to the rural, from the rich to the poor. You've got the ethnic diversity going, meaning culture, different people groups. Um, so we have pockets of diversity, but they're not as widespread across the United States. And so one quick story, Carol, before you lead us into the next question. I grew up attending 6 different Sunday school classes in 6 different languages, Carol. I didn't even speak all of them.
Oh my goodness.
So, my dad preached at the downtown campus a couple of years ago, and my dad is in ministry, works in the Methodist Church in India. And I think the best strategy that mom and dad had to keep me and my brother occupied on Sunday was to send us to all these Sunday school classes. And so we would start like at 8 in the morning with Tamil. Then I would go to like a Gujarati Sunday school class. Then I would go to Telugu. Then I would go to a Marathi, a Malayalam. And the reason I could even do this is because those classes were held in English. And so while people worshiped in their mother tongue, the young kids came together in a Sunday school class that was taught in English. And so we would learn like 1 or 2 songs in those particular languages. But I just remember enjoying, I think it might sound like people would be like, are you kidding me? Like 6 Sunday school classes in a day and all these different people. But it really exposed me, right? It gave me an opportunity to connect with different people from a very young age. So sorry, Carol.
I just listening to you, I recognized, besides English, of course, one of the languages that you said. And the only reason for that is there's a musician I follow who sometimes sings in Tamil.
Carol, who is it?
His name is Peter Mayer. And his parents were missionaries in India, Lutheran missionaries. And so he spoke of Christmas Eves in the village and things like that. And so there's this, one of my favorite songs of his, he stops and sings part of it in Tamil. And I mean, so that's the only reason
Yeah.
anything.
Hey, but that's a great reason because, music and food and movies are some of the best entry points, or even books for that matter. In the West, in the United States, I think one of my quick observations was we love to read. We read about everything. And I found it interesting, back in my seminary days, Carol, so this would have been like 99, 2000, I had friends who would take books with them to doctor's appointments. And I would be like, why are you taking a book? And then my friends would say, well, because when we wait on the doctor, we're going to read. And I'm like, okay. But the reason I found that intriguing is I want to kind of make a distinction in how I perceived that and how I understood it, right? So when you take a book or when you're reading as much as we do, my cultural mindset coming from India was, wow, you're a learned person. Like if you're reading as much as you do, you are a learned person. But then having lived for this long view in the United States, I'm discovering that perhaps that may not always be accurate, right? So we read for pleasure, we read for education, and I'm not quite sure where the gap is, Carol, but somehow reading a book doesn't necessarily translate to being a learned person necessarily.
Well, and oftentimes we read for whatever purpose we need it to be in that moment, and then we kind of forget it. I mean, if I think about all the books I've read, or I read this book for this class, but did I retain any of it, which is where the learned part, right? I mean,
Right.
And so I think for me, you're right. We do. I mean, absolutely. We take a book everywhere we go. My son is 13. Hey, we're running errands. He grabs a book, and I'm grateful. I love that he loves to read.
Yeah.
And I would rather that than him be on his phone or something like that all the time. But
Completely agree. Yeah.
but there is that reality that how much of it do we allow to permeate our
Right.
thoughts and our decisions?
Yeah, I totally agree, Carol, because I think that is one of the practices that I have actually embraced in the United States, right? So now I take a book. I take a book everywhere I go, and I just find that so important and so valuable, because I 100% agree with you that not just for particular people, but just across the board. I think for young individuals in our society, I think that's a much better investment to inform the brain than being on technology as much as we've seen in the last couple decades. And so 100% with you on that. So I think to close up that first question, I think my exposure to diversity at a young age and my deep interest in all things faith and culture really led me to immerse myself in really understanding how does this work, right? So when I first came to the US, again, going back to 99, I really just came with the understanding that I wanted to be equipped and empowered to love God's people everywhere. And so similar to the David Livermore, going on mission trips, and that kind of got him thinking about cultural competency, a lot of us in the, people that, a lot of us in the churches have been on mission trips. I know now with COVID that's limited, but hopefully there will be a resurgence of really being able to engage with the other. And for the purpose of our conversation today, I just want to reiterate that when I talk about the other, I am zooming in on the other as culturally and ethnically, different. Yeah.
No, that's great. And it's interesting, even in the United States, even in Kentucky, I think of a few years ago, our youth went to the Hollers, the Appalachian Mountains in Kentucky, and served. And in many ways, like you said, we can look at one another and go, there are lots of similarities. Our skin color may be the same. We may be from the same state. We may be all of those sort of things. But then there are drastic differences in our culture and understanding of how things work. And then to take that to the next level of another state or another country, especially, and to be sensitive to how we interact with one another, knowing those things that, this is a silly story, but I can remember when I was a child, my aunt and uncle adopted a little boy. And so the first summer we were all together, our grandmother, one night he looked at me and he said, Carol, how come you call Grandma Jean Mimi? And I mean, my other cousins and I were just used to the fact that they called her one thing and my brother and I called her another thing. And yet here we are in the same family, right?
Right.
And he was very confused as to how this woman who he knew was supposed to be both of our grandmothers, but we called her something different. And yet, I mean, I think we have this fear of asking questions because we'll sound stupid or we'll sound uninformed, and yet that's how we learn. And I was so glad he was significantly younger than me, and so I was really glad he felt comfortable to say, who is this person you're talking about?
Right.
And so what a gift that, I'm just grateful that there is research and work being done to help us know how to interact with one another. I think so many conversations I've had lately, and we talk about all persons created in the image of God. And so how do we make sure we treat one another in that light and care for one another? Well, share it with us, Esther. You shared some of this, why culture and ethnicity matters, but then how do we, as First Church members across all three of our campuses, effectively engage with others and who are culturally and ethnically other than us? How do we're a pretty homogenous church, and yet a deep desire to engage our culture in Lexington, which is not homogenous, which, there is great diversity in Lexington. And so what does that look like?
Yeah, and Carol, that would take us more than the time we have allotted, right?
Surface a little.
Yes. So I think, just to perhaps zoom in on one or two starting points, and hopefully this conversation can continue over the next, months as First UMC does the work of identifying what are the ways that they can effectively engage in the context in which they're situated. So the first thing I want to highlight and recognize is that the little I know about First UMC, I really want to appreciate and recognize that there has been a lot of research-driven ministry that First UMC has done. I remember talking with Todd several years ago when the Andover campus was coming up, just what that context looks like and how Andover is so different from downtown and how downtown is so different from Offerings, right? So you've got some very distinct geographical locations, right? And so one of the first things that comes to mind is taking this love for research and understanding of the context that First UMC has, is research the community. Who are the people? And that may already have been done, but some of the best sources of that information are really, what kind of community is built around those areas. So when I think about downtown, I look at the rich diversity that is there in businesses, in restaurants, so who are those people that are making up that particular area? Now, I don't know how far the radius is in terms of from how far out, members come to worship at First Downtown campus. And then similarly, if you look at the Andover campus, it's situated right there by the Hamburg Pavilion. Like that's one of the things that I, remember when I think of Andover. I'm like, yep, it's right over there. So what kind of community is that location framed by, right? Like who are the people that live there, that work there? So understanding who comprises that location, and likewise with Offerings. So having a good understanding, and this is what anybody that's had any exposure to sociology and anthropology would say, let's first figure out who are the people in this area. Who is coming to worship here? Now, along with that, Carol, I'd like to just highlight that oftentimes, at least if I can remember church history well, I think a lot of times the ministries were informed by the communities, right? And now I think we're seeing a slightly different way of ministry, meaning the churches are coming with ready-made programs to insert into a community, right? So we need to balance that well. So like coming with a plan and just saying, yep, this is what we're going to do, but it doesn't inform the local life. And so an understanding of the people and what are the structures that frame the context around these three campuses would be a valuable starting place. And the schools can help you inform that, right? Like what kind of schools are around those locations and who comprises the populations that attend those schools. Like who are the children and what families are they coming from? Because when you look at the Wilmore context, as I understand it from East and West Jessamine, it's heavily endowed with international students because you've got a seminary here which draws like 100+ students from all over the world. And a lot of the East and West Jessamine students have told me, man, I have so many international students as my friends. So that's a distinctive point. And so then that immediately lets you know, okay, there are international people around here somewhere. So how do we reach that community? So I think the critical point is how much does First Church just want to come with tailor-made programs and say, this is what we're going to do as First Church, and where are you maintaining that delicate balance of saying, these are the people we're surrounded by. So let's form ministries that will cater to the needs of those persons, that are around. So I think COVID, sometimes this is not a thought that I've really had a chance to think through completely, but I think COVID has probably shifted how we do church or how we think about church, right? So we've gone from being in a physical location to worship to now worshiping online or worshiping socially distant. There are so many formats that we've had to shift to, and it's causing me to think that perhaps worship is more about being in the community, like just outside of a physical space called church. So there's a combination. I'm not saying that we eliminate the church as a physical space, because that is the gift, like that, the church is the body of Christ, right? So we don't eliminate that, but I think we became so restricted just being in that space that we forgot to look outside.
We got comfortable.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's comfortable and it's easy
Yeah.
to go and do it how we've always done it. And so this being in this pandemic has caused us to search for some creative juices and start looking at, like you said, the church is the body of Christ. And while we love to be together and there's nothing wrong with that, it's caused us to stop and think there's other things that need to be happening. And what a great time to look at our communities and see where the need is. And you're right. I mean, each of our contexts are so uniquely different. I mean, the downtown campus draws people from Georgetown and Wilmore and Nicholasville. And I mean, we come together into the location, whereas Andover is predominantly the 40509. I mean, that is their, I think that's the right zip code. I may have said the wrong one, so I apologize if I did, but that is their area that that they, they're more of a community church. And offerings has an incredible, and they've even already explored some of this. And I mean, there's a large apartment complex across the street from them where many international folks live. And so to be able, they've offered tutoring in English for students, and because here students are coming into the schools who may not speak English as well. And they've had some incredible things there, but we can't get complacent, I guess. We can't,
Right.
our culture is always changing, and people, we live in, I mean, we talk about the diaspora and people spreading, but that's kind of a constant around here. You know, people move, they move in, they move out, they change jobs, you know, situations in life change. And so we can't, you know, that needs to be something looked at regularly, because
Right.
around us is changing.
Yeah, and I think, you know, in addition to understanding the context and what the needs are, I immediately want to follow that up by talking about, you know, what are the discipleship making strategies and techniques, right? So discipleship has become a serious need of the hour. You know, we're living in a time when biblical knowledge or even faith knowledge is so weak. People are not coming with a rich endowment of the biblical text. And when I say rich endowment, I just mean, I think I can safely say that there were decades in the United States where biblical literacy was much higher than it is at this point. Um, and that is due to many reasons, right? So you can't just say, well, this is what caused the lack of biblical literacy, but there are multiple factors. Um, in my humble assessment, I think that leads to the lack of biblical literacy. And so the biblical centered life that perhaps was at one point a cornerstone of this nation um, is shifting to accommodate uh, other things around it, and I think that is something that we need to do a better job in the church of resurrecting. Right? What a good, you know, Carol. Even as I'm sharing this with you, I feel like this is such a good problem. The lack of biblical literacy is such a good problem because it's going to force us, you know, those of us in ministry as clergy or lay persons, but also those of us that just really walk by the Christian ethic and the biblical life ethic. I think such a great opportunity for us to share the love of God with people and start to invite them in ways that are refreshing, to consider the biblical text and to consider that, you know, the meta narrative, but then also the individual stories and how they situate themselves in this biblical meta narrative, you know, that we have. And so I think the discipleship strategies are very critical. You know, one very elementary example is, you know, oftentimes cultural distinctions are not understood well. And some cultural distinctions are far more severe than others, meaning if we have people coming from a cultural context that values hospitality, you're going to have disciple strategies that include hospitality on the front end that creates an environment of welcome and allows a person to be known and to know.
Right.
Right. And I think that's again another interesting tension, a creative tension that we live in the church is we need to know and we need to be known. And how are we doing that? I think is an important question our faith communities need to ask, like, because for me, let me just put myself in the situation, right? So being an ordained elder and I'm in this role at the university, I may act like I don't need to be known. Like, I am the one that's providing these services, and so I need to know. But true transformation comes when you know and you're known. You know, the synergy of that, Carol, I'm really wanting us to zoom in on that as these conversations continue, is how much do we do it in both ways, right? So the person's providing the service, are they known?
Well, and there's, I mean, a hot topic word right now is vulnerability. Uh,
Yes, yes.
that's what it is, and it's easy for me to say, tell me all about you, but I'm going to put a guard up and
Yeah,
not allow you to really know who I am, which isn't going to, the relationship isn't going to grow. And so if we're looking at reaching into our culture, into our surrounding areas, we've got to be willing to let our guard down and say, and I think that's a beautiful, it's that way with God too, right? I mean, it's not just us to know about God, it's to know God and for God to know us, and to quit hiding
that's
hiding
right.
behind, I mean, whatever we're trying to keep from God. And so I think it works up and down and out and around and all of it. That's
Yeah, that's an excellent connection you made, Carol. I think, God um, took it upon himself to come and be in our midst so that we had a way to know who God is, and God clearly knows us because he's made us, right? And so having that exist in our biblical story is so important for us to know and to be known. So as I'm sharing around the question of how does First UMC across the three campuses engage in this work, we do the assessment of understanding where we are, who are the people, what are the needs. We look at discipleship strategies, and then I think finally, um, I would like to offer one other thought, and that is, what kind of community-wide events do we do to invite the others into our midst, right? So oftentimes, those that are not familiar with the life of the church, whether it's how we sit, how is one supposed to sit in a worship service, what kind of songs we sing, or like when do you stand up, when do you sit down, like a lot of these things could be, would create fear for people. You mentioned the fear, piece early on, and it's like we need to do community-wide events. So why not have a community worship night and just open it up to people in the downtown area, or if you're doing it at Andover, open it up and just have an outreach, right? So that's the outreach element that I wanted to be sure to highlight as well. And then making sure that your worship reflects the community that you're surrounded by, right? And you mentioned a very important word, and that is, being a homogeneous unit. And I think, if I were to speak to that point from my work at the university, a lot of our institutions are homogeneous, and they purely the first thing that comes to mind is they're actually just reflecting the demographics of the United States. So even if you look at the statistics for the state of Kentucky, we're about 80 some percent. I think it might be either 85 or 86, but it's 80+% white or Caucasian ethnicity. And then we've got a splattering of all of the other ethnicities, right? Black and Latino and Asian and Native American. So our congregations actually reflect our demographics within our local context, but also nationally. And I think as we see those demographics shift, we are going to have to quickly adapt. Just like we had to adapt to COVID-19, we're going to have to adapt to the changing population trends as it relates to ethnicity. And how do we create church environments that are welcoming again, like, so it's all connected, right? Like it just, one informs the other. And so so I think outreach is also going to become very critical, like a need of the hour, because we can no longer just sit in our churches. I mean, the Barna, the Barna group, I know that you all at First UMC watch those stats quite closely, right? So the Barna group tells us that our church membership is declining. It's been on the decline for several decades, and we are all of a sudden awakened because those numbers are high, and we're actually now feeling it because our congregations are shrinking. And so it's like it takes a while. I'm not an economist, so I don't have the terminology, but it takes a while for us to feel the impact of a cultural shift that actually has been occurring over a time.
For quite a long time, yes. Yeah. I loved your idea of, we are very used to when we stand, when we sit. If you're Catholic, you're very used to kneel at this point, or, all of those sort of things. And how awkward it is if you don't know those. Todd and I talk regularly, we talk in staff that we recite the Apostles' Creed and don't think anything of it. And yet, if you're new to the church, that's a big deal.
Yeah.
And it's okay to read it. And so we often will read it because we don't want to come across as, you should know this, or, and that's a small thing, but it's a big thing if you're the one feeling like everybody can see that I don't have this memorized. And I'll tell you, I messed up the Lord's Prayer the other day and stuff because I had my hymnal open and it was different than what we normally say. And then I got myself confused on the words. And I've been saying the Lord's Prayer since I could speak, probably.
Sure.
But I totally messed it up leading it in worship. And it happens.
Yeah.
But I was thinking, when I lived in Oklahoma, our Jewish temple hosted a huge fun event. But they invited people from the community. You would come in, and they had things like bouncy houses and stuff, which made it fun for children, but they had traditional foods for us to taste. They invited us on a tour of their synagogue, and then they took us in and let us experience what a bat mitzvah would be like, or a bar mitzvah, or a service that here, we bring the scroll in at this point, and this is how things go. And I thought, how beautiful it was to learn in their setting, their traditions, and to understand more. And we went several years in a row with our youth group because it was so fascinating to be immersed in.
Yeah. Carol, you reminded me of two things. At the university a couple years ago, we did a program called Worship 328, which was fashioned around Galatians 3:28, right? There's neither Jew nor Greek. We're all one. The verse goes on, but we're all one in Christ Jesus. And what we did in that program is we allowed our students to sign up, and we gave them an opportunity to attend all the different ethnic churches in Lexington. And I had no idea, Carol, how many ethnic churches. Right now, I don't know how First UMC could build strategic partnerships with these congregations, because you could even have their choir come and perform, right? So, my family loves the choir at First UMC, right? Like, it is just phenomenal music, just powerful. So good singing, you can take away the significance of good singing, right? We want good singing, but there is good singing in other ethnic groups, right? So how do we extend our boundaries to allow that good singing to come and shape our experience of worship? So I don't know how that could be done, but it can definitely be thought through about how it could be done. So students got to go to a Ukrainian church that's right there off of Brannan Crossing, um, a Japanese church, a Chinese church, a Korean church, a Haitian church. Um, I, I was just amazed. Hispanic churches, like, there's so much to learn. And the students were so uncomfortable because these worship services were happening in those native languages. But because the church knew that we're outsiders, and because we knew that we were outsiders to that community, there was a level of grace that was extended in not knowing when to sit and when to stand and not being able to sing in that language. But there has to be that grace extended.
At
And
all
sorry, Carol, go ahead. What did you say?
at all times, right? Anytime there's a visitor in our midst, to truly, I mean, that welcoming spirit of it's okay.
Absolutely. So I think we've lost that flexibility of knowing. I think you really hit the nail on the head when you said complacency is a challenge for us because we just get settled into our behavior patterns, and it's hard to change, but it's necessary, to change. So maybe there's a way for First UMC to really look at strategic partnerships on a small scale level. Begin with something small and then look at how, because perhaps it could become a model. First UMC could become a model church community for our conference to show how we do these partnerships across ethnic and cultural lines, right? And one thing I mentioned in a podcast I did not too long ago is inviting speakers, preachers, inviting people from these different ethnic communities that share the common heritage, right? So you all invited me on multiple occasions. So inviting persons who are different from ourselves to share in the pulpit or share in other forms of worship, even in the basic elements of worship, right? Like lighting the candles or like reading a scripture, include the diversity that you already have present. I may have seen like one or two families of Black descent in one of the congregations of First UMC. And so I just mentioned that to say, I think that there is a desire for that to grow. And I think people want to come to these churches, but we need to become welcoming. Like and welcoming doesn't mean we give up who we are, right? And that's, before we get off of this call, Carol, I want to make sure I say that, and I wish I could put it in all caps to highlight how critical this is, right? Because welcoming others doesn't mean I give up who I am or what I believe in or what I understand my faith to be. Of course, it needs to be corrected where it's inaccurately understood, but it means that I am adding to my life. Like in this conversation that you and I have had, I have not become any less of who I am, and you have not become any less of who you are. If anything, I am thinking, Carol, let's get coffee because I want to hear the Montana story and I want to hear about your journey across the United States. And so it's like, there's a richness that comes. And I think along with that, I just want to say, oftentimes in our Christian and even evangelical, Carol, I feel like we've just started to get into the deep part of this conversation, right? Because the evangelical faith formation in North America is so complex and has complicated matters. And you've got all these strands within evangelicalism that have really fashioned themselves around particular ways of understanding the biblical text. And Carol, we've got to do a part, 1, 2, 3, 4. Can we just like plan for?
I said, oh, we won't go that long. And here we are at our max time because you've got to get on another meeting. But thank you.
Carol, let me finish that thought. So evangelicalism
Yeah.
So sorry. Yeah. So evangelicalism has really posed a major challenge, oh my goodness, I don't know how to emphasize that, but our intentions have always been good, right? We want to worship God and we want to care for people. But somehow we shifted from the access and we became worshipers of our style, right? Like, this is how we do things. This is how we do church. We became worshipers of the way we do things as opposed to things that we do, right? Like, so what I do should be more important than how I do it, perhaps. Or maybe there's a fine line in holding those two in tension. And I just want to say, that, and where I was going with that is oftentimes humility or being humble is, understood as, well, humble yourself, like don't be so prideful, or don't be, well, I want to remind us that humility really doesn't mean that I think less of myself, right? Humility means that I don't think of myself any more or any less than the person right next to me. And so there is a way of understanding these rich biblical principles that I think have somehow over time lost lost the meaning, or lost the we need to re-inform our theology, right? Like we need to like our theological sensibilities need to be reinformed. That's what I'm trying to say, Carol, is our theological sensibilities need to be reinformed. Because what we've done is we have created categories and labels, and I think that has bled into behaviors that have not allowed us to extend beyond our comfort zones. So, sorry, Carol, that was a mouthful at the end here.
Oh my goodness, this has been such a rich time for me, and you're right, we're just scratching the surface right now and beginning these conversations, and so I look forward to us talking again, and I thank you so much for your time today, and pray that as you transition into your new role at the university, that things
Thank you.
are just fantastic and go well. And so thank you, Esther. Appreciate
Thank you so much, Carol. Thank you. And look forward to being with you again, hopefully soon. And once again, just my deep gratitude to the First UMC family, to Todd, and all of the incredible clergy that work on the different campuses. Thankful for your presence in our community.
Great. Thanks, Esther. Take care.
Bye.
Well, friends, it was an incredible joy to talk with Esther Jadhav today. And I hope that if there was anything in our conversation that made you think of something that you want to see happen across one of our campuses, or you're excited about or want to continue the conversation, please reach out and let us know. Have a great day.